America's center of power changed, and with it, the dynamics of the political landscape. The consequences will reverberate locally, in Florida, on Capitol Hill, and on the global stage. Voters demanded change on the issues that mattered most: the economy, immigration, and social issues. Now, News4JAX goes beyond the headlines with political analysts who provide unique context and perspective. Experts focused on the issues making headlines. This is Politics and Power.
If you were betting the shutdown would hand one party a decisive political victory, right now the odds are not great for either. Early polling gave Republicans a modest edge in perceived blame, but as the shutdown has stretched into its second week, voters have started to spread the responsibility around. And a lot of them are simply fed up with the spectacle. Welcome to Politics and Power. I'm Bruce Hamilton, and joining me, News4JAX political analyst Rick Mullaney. Thanks for being here.
Great to be with you, Bruce.
So, Rick, the dynamics here are interesting. You look at the polls, and the bottom line is this is not a clear win for anyone.
It is not, Bruce. The Democrats are blaming the Republicans are blaming the Democrats. And quite frankly, when you step back, this is a self-inflicted wound for the country. It's not good for the country. It's not good for federal workers. It's not good for the public. And by the way, it's not good for the economy. Back in 2013, when we had an extended shutdown, some studies say we lost $24 billion. So your point is well taken. There's no clear winner, but there are some clear losers. And we know that this is not the way you make good public policy for Republicans or Democrats.
And it's interesting because if you look at the polls, independents blame both Democrats and Republicans, but everybody agrees on one thing. It's time for them to play nice in the sandbox and get this over with.
I do think that's true. By the way, the polling has been a little bit mixed here. Democrats now have a little bit of an edge, and by that I mean they're blaming the Republicans more. Donald Trump, surprisingly, his poll numbers have risen a little bit. Now, maybe that's due to foreign policy and the return of the hostages, and he's had some successes in other areas. But for Donald Trump, politically, it hasn't yet had a downside. For the Republicans, they're being blamed a little bit more. But your point is a good one. Those independent voters, however, are seeing this more through the Democratic lens. Politics will play a great role in resolving this, but both sides need to resolve it for the sake of the country.
And we'll talk about the president's role in all of this in a little bit, or his lack of involvement, and how that's played out with everything. So the politics here seem diffuse. Party identification still heavily colors answers. Democrats blame Republicans, Republicans blame Democrats. But as I mentioned, the independents are the wild card here, and they're more inclined to hand responsibility to both sides to see the shutdown itself. The shutdown itself, they see, is what the problem is.
Very much, and by the way, I agree with them. If you look at the history here, the shutdowns really from 1980 until now, we've had about 15 shutdowns. Only 4 of them have been more than 4 days, including this one. This is the second longest in history. Today is day 28. Back in 2019 with Donald Trump, it went 35 days. That was over a wall for an immigration. Back with Barack Obama in 2013, it went on for 16 days. With Bill Clinton back in 1995-96, it went for 21 days. And so in each of those, as I said earlier, it's not good for the country. It's not a good way to make public policy. And this all is rooted sort of in the filibuster and the attempt by the party that's the minority typically to try to leverage the shutdown for policy objectives. Republicans have tried to do that in the past. It's hurt them politically. We'll see if this happens with Democrats as they try to leverage a shutdown for their policy objectives, which is primarily health care.
All right, so is the real problem here that nobody wants to work with anybody? Nobody can work with the president?
Bruce, I think it goes much deeper than that. I think for Democrats, there's been growing frustration that during the first 9.5 months, let's say, just over of the Trump presidency, they've stood by and they have watched Donald Trump expanding executive power. In the first 100 days, there were 140 executive orders. And by the way, it's continued since on a variety of fronts, from tariffs to immigration to deportation to foreign policy, you name it. And their base wants the Democrats back in the game, and they want to redefine their position. And quite frankly, even with the big, beautiful bill, because of reconciliation, a majority vote and they were done. This is different. They do have leverage here. They do have power here. And what they can do because of the filibuster, and it requires 60 votes in the Senate to pass a bill, which hasn't been passed for October 1st, they can now say, listen, our policy objectives, and they take the high road with the public, is health care. And we care about the subsidies, the Affordable Care Act subsidies that will expire at the end of this year. We also care about Medicaid and how that's been cut. And unless you come to the table and negotiate these, we're going to have the government shut down. So it goes a little bit deeper on their side. On the Republican side, they try to claim and do claim the moral high ground. They say, look, we have a clean continuing resolution. There's no policy issues in there. With Joe Biden, we did this 13 times with him where we just continued the government. And we've had shutdowns in the past. The Democrats have been the ones arguing, hey, don't shut down the government for your policy objectives, keep the government going. So I do think it goes pretty deep. And one of the problems and why this is going on so long is each side is entrenched in their position. For the Democrats, they want to win. For the Republicans, they feel they have the moral high ground and they believe in their bill. And that's why it's the second longest in history so far and could very well be the longest in U.S. history.
And what's interesting here, and it's a dynamic that I wouldn't have expected, is there's some fracture within the parties. Take the Republican Party. Who would have thought that Marjorie Taylor Greene would have been one to say, yo, we're not taking the high road here, we're not taking the proper road?
Well, you've actually been seeing this going back and forth a little bit on the strategy of the votes. They tend, depending on what's at stake. In the Senate, for example, you've seen a number of Democrats come over. Republicans don't have enough votes to get to 60. They're now at 55, including those Democrats that have come over. You've seen about 3. So they need 5 more. In the House, it's really, really tight. And as you just mentioned, Marjorie Taylor Greene going in a different place. Generally speaking, when push comes to shove, they fall in line. The Republicans fall in line, the Democrats fall in line, or they do some head counting to make sure that they get to the right place. In the end, this will be very difficult to solve, but already there's some mounting pressure here, and you can begin to see maybe a potential light at the end of the tunnel.
All right, so when the shutdown first started, there was some reason for optimism. A bipartisan clutch of rank and file senators were at least talking, but 4 weeks in, there is no conversation. Nobody's talking, at least that we know of. You know, back in the old days, the conversation was had over a drink, over a whiskey and a sandwich in a bar, and things were resolved there, not in the halls of Congress. But right now, it doesn't appear that anybody's talking in any venue. Do they even know what would break the stalemate?
Bruce, we talked about this earlier. The shutdown context is a little different, although there's a partisan divide for everything. And what may start to break this stalemate is growing pressure. And that growing pressure is going to come, for example, and this happened years ago in 2019, which we were shut down for 35 days, is air traffic controllers and flights being missed and the public wanting resolution. It comes when SNAP benefits, over 40 million Americans who are affected who may not get those benefits come November 1st. This affects 2 million federal workers, but 1 million of those workers, as of now, are scheduled not to get their paycheck. Troops who aren't getting their paycheck. So the drumbeat will grow, the pressure will grow. It'll try to break the stalemate here to get Republicans and Democrats to do what you're talking about, to get to the table and resolve this in some sort of compromise. But as long as the Republicans feel they have the moral high ground, there has to be a continuing resolution. As long as Democrats feel that they have to have their health care, all of it that they're talking about, whether that's $500 billion or $1.5 trillion, however you do your math, you're going to end up in this stalemate. I suspect they'll be somewhere in between. We're going to have to wait and see. But for now, they are deeply entrenched. They're blaming each other. And that's why, as I said earlier, this is so long and it could go longer.
It's interesting. You mentioned SNAP benefits. 42 million Americans rely on that to put food on the table. There's going to be food insecurity. 3 million people right here in Florida. So if you look back to 2018, 2019, the USDA has a contingency fund. They used it back then. There is precedent. They could have set the wheels in motion when this whole thing started and said, look, we've got you covered there. Is this being used for political leverage?
Potentially so, because according to what you've seen coming out of the White House is that that's not available this time. And this time those benefits, I think it comes November 1st, will not be available. And you're beginning to see, like I said, that growing pressure. You saw one of the federal unions yesterday come out and ask the Democrats to have a clean continuing resolution. And I think the Democrats here do have the possibility of extracting a promise on public policy for a continuing resolution. And if the promise isn't fulfilled, they can shut it down again at the end of that continuing resolution. So deep, deep politics at here. But Republicans and Democrats are going to begin to feel the heat. And that heat will grow because this is going to get worse, not better.
Oh, no doubt. It seems like they don't see the forest for the trees. If you look to history, this is a stark shift from 2018, the shutdown during Trump's first term, which, if I remember right, you know, before that shutdown, he basically said, it is up to the president to go ahead and keep something like this from happening, but I digress. So a Senate gang helped negotiate a deal back then that was built on bipartisanship, which is not a word that we hear much of, at least publicly these days. But the Senate's changed dramatically since then. Those deal-making senators, you've got, Rob Portman, who was from Ohio, Joe Manchin, an independent from West Virginia, Mitt Romney from Utah, a Republican, and Kristen Sinema from Arizona, also a Republican. They've all retired. And what that did was that hollowed out the core of lawmakers with any experience crossing the aisle. That's been exacerbated by party leaders in deep frustration with an administration that basically has taken a sledgehammer to a government funding process that once provided a basic framework for bipartisanship inside the Senate. Does this all come down to a lack of trust?
Somewhat, Bruce, particularly on the Democratic side, there's a lack of trust, but the dynamics today are different from what you just described. The Republicans argue that the dynamics are different for Senator Schumer in particular, who voted for the continuing resolution last March, but they believe he's concerned about getting primaried in New York. He wants to deliver to his base, and one of the ways he's delivering to his base is serving up, of course, this advocacy on the health care policy issue. Republicans, Majority Leader Thune, taking a very hard line. And it goes back to this partisan divide that is deeper than ever, and both sides convinced of the righteousness of their cause. As I said, in the past, since 1980, when this first began, the longest we've had was the 35 days in 2019. For Barack, but that was about the wall. And the wall, I don't think, is nearly as compelling as health care. People care about health care. Some care about the wall. Back in 2013, it was about the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. That was Ted Cruz, and that was a 16-day shutdown, in which Republicans came out, I believe, on the short end. In 1995-96 with Bill Clinton, it was about government spending. Again, the public, maybe not as sympathetic. One of the things that Democrats do have going for them is that this is an issue that affects many Americans, and premiums are about to rise. And beware, Republicans, when premiums rise here shortly, some may attribute it to the shutdown. For some, it will rise because of expiring benefits, but for others, health care costs are rising. So we are in quite a circumstance right now. I would distinguish it from those past circumstances, but moving forward for the country, there's got to be a better way to do public policy. And for the filibuster, which is, by the way, is a little bit wobbly right now, and many are discussing we should even do away with it, which is the holy grail for many when it comes to this issue. And then it's hard to limit it just to this issue. But I predict that in the future, the party who's in the minority will use this leverage again for their policy objectives. And many argue, and I'm kind of in this camp, that leveraging a shutdown for your priorities really shouldn't be a part of this process. Republicans have done it, and Democrats are now doing it, and it'll happen again in the future.
You talked about Chuck Schumer. I mean, basically, selfish reasons he's doing this. He knows he wants to be reelected. That may not be the entire package here, but it's a big factor.
Well, welcome to politics in Washington, D.C. Yeah. It's true on the Republican side. It's true on the Democratic side. And a lot of this is an eye towards a year from next month, which is the midterms. They're trying to position themselves for the midterms. The party out of power, the Democrats, typically do very well in those midterm elections. They're trying to position themselves for that. The Republicans are hoping to defy history a little bit from a year from now. But the stakes are very, very high. And that's why, in fact, I think they're so entrenched.
I was going to ask you about that at the end of this program, but because you brought up the midterms, let me bring it up now. The American public has a very short memory span. We're talking about the midterms being a year from now. Is it really going to matter? Say for the fact that you may have people who go without health care, or, may not be able to afford health care, people who can't put food on the table. But overall, will this really affect the outcome?
Bruce, it's 13 months from now. It's often a distant memory, but I do think for Democrats, they want to reposition themselves. They want to find their footing. They want to find their message, and this is a part of that. And they want to deliver to their base. The Republicans also want to deliver to their base. They believe that the big budget bill they passed does that. And so you may see compromise here in which you actually some bipartisanship in which there are some extension of some health care benefits, maybe not the extent that the Democrats are seeking. But like you're saying, this is all with an eye towards next year. Will this be the defining moment for what happens in the midterms? I don't think so. What will be defining, I think, will be the economy, affordability. We're also going to see on the foreign policy front, which isn't typically a big deal in these elections, maybe more so this year. We'll see what happens in Ukraine. Unfortunately, we may or not see whether the peace holds in the Middle East. We'll have to wait and see. High stakes, By the time we get to next summer, it'll get somewhat baked in. Will this be a major factor? Not so sure, but I do think those other factors will be big factors, such as the economy and affordability.
And you got to consider when you talk about foreign policy, of course, there's the war in Ukraine, there's a situation in Gaza, and other factors, but you also have to talk about tariffs, and that plays back to the number one thing that will get to the American sentiment, that's the economy.
Well, make no mistake, we could have this on another program, but keep your eyes open on this big argument for the U.S. Supreme Court. This is one of the biggest cases in years. I think the Trump administration has the weaker argument here, and many think because it's a conservative court, they're going to go their way. I'm not so sure about that. That's high stakes next week, and if they rule that the tariffs are illegal, which is the majority of these tariffs, some of the tariffs are based on an independent statute, it's going to be really significant. And how you unwind that and where we go from here. So right now, we're at a critical inflection point on multiple fronts with the shutdown, with those arguments before the Supreme Court, and as you said, tariffs. We'll have to see come next spring what that real impact of tariffs is going to be on the economy. That, I think, will be more significant for the midterms than the shutdown.
You mentioned the Supreme Court. A lot of people say, okay, well, you look what the rulings have been on some of the arguments going along when it comes to tariffs. You've got to understand that that's not an arbiter of how the court's going to rule when it comes before the full court. Basically, they've got some short memos, and, you know, the Trump administration presented things to them that they knew were in their favor going there. So, you know, that's got to be taken into consideration with the Supreme Court. The other thing is that I think President Trump knows that he's got a battle ahead of him because he's basically said, you know, I think I'm going to go ahead and spend some time and be there in the court when they do the oral arguments so I can listen in. An attempt at intimidation, I don't know, but that's highly unusual.
Unprecedented, really, and like I said, we can make a whole program out of this, but in the end, I try not to predict because I'm wrong so often. I think it's an uphill battle for the Trump administration when it comes to tariffs. I do not expect the Supreme Court to uphold it. We'll have to wait and see. And with their major questions doctrine, with some of their prior decisions, with many of the judicial philosophy of the conservative side, I expect this to be very problematic for the Trump administration. That is going to have a big impact in the year ahead.
I think you're more right than you want to give yourself credit for, but I'll leave it at that. What's the biggest challenge here for the would-be negotiators to figure out how to sweep or to bridge sweeping policy and political divides?
I think they need to find a way for both sides to declare victory so we can all move on. To come up with come up with a solution. The Republicans will claim they've won. The Democrats will claim they've won. Regardless, we need the public to win. We need the government to be funded. We need 2 million workers to, well, we'll leave it to the pundits as to how many it should be. But we need to be paying our federal workers. We need to be paying our troops. We need to make sure that the air traffic controllers are fully staffed. And we need to make sure that the public is going to be well served. And so, like I said, the pressure is growing on each side. Each side wants a political win. We need to give each side an off-ramp here. Maybe that will be a compromise on some of the health care benefits and a compromise on some of the Medicaid provisions. We'll have to wait and see.
See, no, it's interesting because you and I were talking before the show, and you may have gleaned over it very briefly, but it seems to me that this is a perfect solution, knowing that everybody wants victory. You have the Democrats sit back and say, okay, you know what? We want this give and take when it comes to health care. We are going to go ahead with the CR right now, and this is what Rick and I were talking about, what Rick said might very well work, but we know very well that there's another shutdown date that could potentially come November 21st. We'll acquiesce now, but if you don't give us what we expect in the way of compromise or find some middle ground on this issue, then all bets are off.
Very much so. You've also seen a little bit of an indication from Vice President Vance that they may be willing to do something during that negotiation period. So Democrats, for many reasons, might not want to go there, but one of their options is to agree to a continuing resolution with a promise that they'll negotiate on these points. You negotiate during the interim. If you don't get what you want, at the end of that continuing resolution, you could get back to this process once again. That is certainly something the Democrats could do. That's one possibility here. Another possibility is you reach a compromise on those actual benefits. I tend to think the Democrats would be better served by the former strategy, but they've got to make that decision. But that is one of the cards that they can play.
What's the gambler's creed? Know when to hold them, know when to fold them. I mean, you know, that's where you go. The biggest problem is both sides think that there is political advantage in sticking with their positions. And with that attitude, are they up against a proverbial brick wall?
Yes. Bruce, as long as each side believes it's in their self-interest and to their political advantage, this goes nowhere. And what's going to happen in the end, and I will discuss this some, is Donald Trump's return from what he's been doing overseas could have a big impact on this if he could help break the logjam. But right now, Republicans believe they're winning politically, and they don't see an incentive to change. Democrats believe they're winning, and they don't see an incentive to change. What's the result? This thing goes on. The pressure will continue, as we talked about before, and then whether it's polling or whether something else happens, there's going to be added pressure and a crack in which they believe politically it's in their self-interest to get this resolved. That needs to happen sooner rather than later.
Brought up something interesting. J.D. Vance. President Trump's been out of the country. He's been dealing with other issues. J.D. Vance has taken a very prominent role on some important issues, roles that you usually don't see a vice president take. Is that sending a message?
Well, potentially so. And you've seen a lot of comments about the president on Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. But in this particular one, you've seen the vice president make some comments about trying to resolve this in a way in which more of a compromising spirit on health care. And that may be one of the pathways here to get this resolved.
Is this maybe seeing if he is presidential material?
Well, with that's always going to be
speculative.
President Trump's thoughts, yes.
So, is there a way out? Has the Senate thrown in the towel? Talk about that when Politics and Power continues. Welcome back to Politics and Power. Bruce Hamilton, along with News4JAX political analyst Rick Mullaney, who is also the executive director of the Haskell Public Policy Institute. So we always call it the JU Public Policy Institute, but Preston Haskell, very prominent in the community, has stepped forward to make sure that you continue your work.
Couldn't be more pleased than to have Preston Haskell, name associated with the university and named after Preston Haskell. He was a founding board member of the Public Policy Institute 14 years ago. He's played a great role in shaping this institute in so many ways, on the curriculum, in our partnerships, our relationship with the law school and beyond that. And for anybody who knows Preston Haskell and his history, it's not just about the Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute. It's about healthcare, it's about education, it's about the arts. He truly is one of the great business, civic, and community leaders in the history of our city. What he built in the Haskell Company is extraordinary from the 1960s to now, a company that began here and is now global. And he is a great role model for our students. And we are beyond pleased that we are now the Haskell Public Policy Institute.
And ironically, the issues that you mentioned are front and center, and the great deal of debate is surrounding them right now. So we've been talking about the stalemate on Capitol Hill and the lack of bipartisan talks that's led to this federal government shutdown, and it's dragging on. Don't seem to be some substantive bipartisan talks going on, if any at all. There may be some in back hall corridors, we just don't know. But one of the biggest problems is that President Trump and Senate leaders will tell you this. Political analysts will tell you this as well. He has been disengaged, consumed by foreign affairs. He had, I think it was a 1-hour meeting with some senators, and that didn't go very well. Does he need to become more involved for us to reach the kind of resolution? Should he be more involved and more proactive?
Well, the first answer to your first question is yes. In the end, the Republican Party will fall in line with where President Trump is. And so far, he's been pretty vocal in blaming the Democrats. He's been talking about the problem with air traffic controllers. He's been talking, and he believes he's got the political high ground, and his approval ratings suggest that. But his matters on foreign policy have been very, very substantial. But clearly, he has been out of the country on so many fronts, in China, in Japan, the Middle East. So when he comes back, this shutdown, as we talked about in the first half of this program, it's not good for the country, it's not good for government, it's not good for the federal workers, and it's not good for the economy. It needs to be resolved, and it's going to take his leadership, and it's going to take Democratic leadership to get this done. And I'm hopeful when he returns, I'm hoping that's what will happen.
How about those who criticize the president and say that he's allowing this to go on for his own means in order to downsize government, continue with federal government layoffs, to have more control about what happens in the context of federal government? Well,
I don't know if that's a negotiating strategy that he's using, because he is using it. He is suggesting that Democrats have served up to him on a silver platter an opportunity to downsize the federal government, which he's been in the process of doing since he's taken office, to change some of this funding, to redefine what an essential worker is. I'm not so sure. But I do think his calculation is much like Chuck Schumer's calculation, which is much like all Capitol Hill and the White House, which is the political calculation. Where is he politically? What does this allow him to do? And an eye towards the midterms again next year. And so there needs to be a motivation for the president in his self-interest to resolve this, just as there is on the Democratic side. The pressure, as I mentioned earlier, will continue to grow. And despite the fact that this is the second longest in history and could very well be the longest, there will be this pressure to get this resolved.
And despite what we're privy to publicly, you know that there's infighting going on behind those closed doors, even within the Trump administration. There's a new book about to come out by a former ABC White House chief correspondent. It's called Retribution. And it talks about some of the squabbling that people just really didn't understand was going on within the administration itself and with some of the president's moves and policies.
No surprise, Bruce, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level, you don't want to see how the sausage is being made either in the legislature or the executive branch. There certainly is internal disagreement, I'm confident, in the White House, and there's an internal disagreement on the Democratic side. And you've seen a few come over. That could change in the future. Regardless, they tend to present a united front. Behind those closed doors, I suspect there's lots of dissension and lots of different views on how to move this forward.
You also see some moves being made, and this did not get a lot of play, but somebody that you and I know very well, who is very close to Mr. Trump and has his ear, Susie Wiles, she just basically came out and publicly said, you know what, when it comes to this issuing pardons and things, I'm going to take a little more control here. There's a message there.
Well, we'll see. I'm a big fan of Susie's. She worked here locally for a long time. I think she's practical. She's solutions-oriented. Part of her secret approach to this, or is her approach, is she lets Donald Trump be Donald Trump.
She doesn't want to be in the public eye.
She has no choice, and she has intentionally taken that very low profile, not because she's shy, not because she's very articulate. Strategically, I think it's the right move. We'll see if she helps them navigate this.
Well, that's why I thought it was interesting that she stepped in on this whole pardon issue, because I think she thought the administration, especially with pardoning George Santos, may have been overstepping its bounds. Because all of a sudden she goes, you know what? Maybe this whole idea of everybody and anybody can get a pardon is a little bit out of control. I've got to rein it in a little bit. And that's Susie's strength, reining things in and giving it perspective.
It is a strength. I've seen it in the past, but that was minor league baseball compared to the playing field she's on right now. Reining it in the Trump administration it's a little challenging.
So let's talk about the options and a way out here. Commentators call a clean continuing resolution, which you've said, as the least politically costly, fastest fix. It would buy the time, as you have so articulately pointed out, to get a negotiated package. And, you know, they've got another shutdown that would be looming where they say, we gave you a chance, you didn't take it.
Well, part of the Republican argument, you certainly see this from the Speaker, Speaker Johnson, when he says, look, we did this 13 times during the Biden years, and they're taking that argument. When they say clean CR, they're saying, hey, we're not attaching policy riders to this. This is the Biden budget that we're seeking to continue, and we're putting an end date on it, and we'll negotiate with you in the interim. And then at that end date, Democrats are back in that position. So the strongest argument that the Republicans make for now is do a continuing resolution, and we'll discuss the policy side. That's certainly one approach. For the Democrats, if they're insistent on the full changes that they want in terms of the extension of the subsidies over the next decade and in terms of Medicare, that's going to be a heavy, heavy lift. They have a couple options. They can reduce that and compromise on that, or they can go to the continuing resolution and see if they can get something more. But the reason we're still talking about this, the reason we're on day 28 and the longest in history is day 35, and it looks like this is going to go on, is because they are very entrenched in believing that politically they've got the high ground, and they think from a policy standpoint they've got the policy high ground.
And you bring up a good point, because the real fight here is over policy riders, high-stakes demands, immigration, border enforcement, health care subsidy extensions, broad spending cuts. Analysts say that those are the issues that have to be carved out or deferred if a quick deal is to happen, which is what you were just saying.
They have to be, Bruce. They have to, more often than not, they need to be separate, and I think they are. The Democrats are focused, pretty laser focused. It's about health care, and health care. In particular, it's those subsidies that are about to expire, that, by the way, were implemented during COVID. And now COVID has passed, and they want to continue them. The same as SNAP benefits that were increased during COVID. Now you want to continue them. And then, of course, Medicaid. In the budget this summer, which was done through reconciliation, the reduction in Medicaid payments, Democrats are also focused on that. So I don't think it's the whole panoply of policy riders. I think it's smart strategy for the Democrats. They're focused on health care, and that is something that people do care about.
Based on our conversation and based on the things you've said, I walk away with the opinion that what this is really all about is politics and not procedure.
Absolutely so. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. That is what this is about. Now, procedurally, the filibuster is what puts you in position to do this. Democrats do have the leverage because of the filibuster, and they want to be a participant. And so far during the Trump administration, they've been on the sidelines, and they've come off the sidelines with this and a big policy objective, and they're trying to redefine where they are. That is also politics. For the Republicans, it's politics. No great surprise that oftentimes in political campaigns and otherwise, politics will often trump policy. This is not the way to make good public policy, so I hope we make some adjustments in the procedure, but yes, this is politics.
Do you think we'll have a new record with a new longest federal government shutdown? And if that's the case, by the holidays?
Very likely this sets the record for being the longest ever, although as I mentioned earlier in the program repeatedly, there's mounting pressure on multiple fronts. You hope that's going to create a crack here, but for the immediate future, it looks like this is going to continue on.
Rick Mullaney from the Haskell Public Policy Institute at Jacksonville University. Always a pleasure. Appreciate your context, perspective, and focus. Appreciate anything that you've got to say. Remember, keep it real and keep it cordial. Thanks for watching Politics and Power.
See why every day more people are choosing News4JAX, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.